You are out of focus.
Hello, and welcome to Office Hours. We have our first hour of question and answer for your media and production questions, but we're happy to announce that we're bringing back our education hour. John Snyder is here with us for our education hour, so he'll be leading us in a discussion, just following our question and answers on media, and he'll be focusing on learning objectives. So, John, we're looking forward to your education hour discussion. We have a great panel. We see some new faces here on the panel too, which is fantastic. So we're happy to answer your questions. Saturday is a good day to try new roles, either in front of or behind the camera. We have a great production crew that puts this show together every day. And we take advantage of the weekends to add new things and try new things as well. So if you haven't, ask to be a part of it, either in front of or behind the camera. Well, we'll have Ken start us off. Ken, what do we have?
Good day, Josh and everyone. The first question comes from Deborah Woodfork in Washington, D.C., who asks, what would you recommend for an app to use during an in-person event to capture notes and photos to use later for a lessons learned, post-briefing, event group conversation and survey?
Good, Alex.
Yeah, it depends, as always. So I think that one of the things that it depends on is whether you're on a Mac or PC or iPhone or Android. On an iPhone, I generally use Notes. And the reason I use Notes is because it shows up everywhere. So it's on all my Macs, iPads, phone, no matter where I'm at, I can have a note. Now, what I'll do is I'll pop a note up, since I use Notes so much for so many things. I'll have that and I'll pin it to keep it at the top, and I'll sort it up to the top there so that I can find it quickly during an event. And one of the keys to Notes is to make sure that you name it correctly. So what I do is I name the client, I have the project, I have the date, and usually the start time, all in that first line so that I can see it there. And most importantly, I can search for it. What was that meeting that I had with this client on this at this time on this day? I might be able to see it in my iCal, but I want to be able to find it. So I have all that stuff in my title. And then after that, I just start adding stuff to it, and it just adds to everything. And no matter where I'm at, I can put those notes in. And I used to use lots of other things. I used Google Docs. I used all kinds of other things. And you can do that. I just find that the most seamless one for an Apple user is Notes.
Fantastic. And Jeff?
Yeah, and I agree for a Mac. I think that's awesome. It's and especially if you want to share this with anyone, as long as everyone is on the Apple platform, that's great. For cross-platform, I think Google Keep is great. Underrated. It works on every client, desktop, web. You can share individual items in Google Keep. Unfortunately, you can't share a folder, or they use labels as folders, and it'd be nice if you could share that. But individual notes, which can be virtually anything, just a document with text, lists, and virtually every other type of media, web links, everything can all be stored in there and organized in Google fashion. And as long as they don't eventually kill it like they do with everything else, I think it's an awesome cross-platform. You don't have to worry about what anyone's on.
Yeah, absolutely. I like the checkbox feature of Google Keep, and you can check things off, whatever. Jeff, is that your first comment? First time on the panel?
It is, yes.
Oh, welcome. Glad to have you.
Yep.
Harshit?
Yeah, so I wanted to second that with the Google Keep suite, and just a suite of Google products. Normally, if you use just Google Drive, or even type in your browser if you're logged in onto your account, doc.new, you could pretty much pop up a document and start typing and have a conversation. So when you're doing meetings and stuff, I think having that cross-platform capability between Android, iPhone, or Windows, it makes it a little bit more seamless. Microsoft products are fine, and if you're into that environment, which most education environments are on 365, that's not bad either. It just depends on what is going to be strategically better for you and who has the ability to obtain the documents. So it's always an important piece to remember that if you're using, let's say, Microsoft, make sure that someone outside of that conversation can at least achieve the same conversation as you are or collaborating with. So for me, I would defer to Google, and as Google Keep is to Notes is to Apple, so Apple Notes. So that's why I choose that.
Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, and by the way, the checkmark feature is also in Notes, and I use it all the time. That's how I shop. So I go to the market, and I share that Notes with my wife, and then she adds things to it all day, and then I just show up, and all I have to do is hit the little check boxes. The main reason that I use Notes instead of the Google ones is because the connectivity and just the flow of it, of how fast I can put things in, while at venue. Speed of entry is the most important thing, because I'm usually doing something else. I'm not just managing what's not working. And so, and to the point, it almost always ends up in a Google Doc or a sheet afterwards. So it's the raw gathering of the data. And a lot of times if I have an iPad, of course I'm drawing in Notes, like drawing little diagrams of this is what we need to do and this is how we need to do it, which would be difficult in other platforms. And I just haven't found any other platform that did it as fast, so it's speed of entry. But I do agree with the idea that once it's done, usually that gets ported into some kind of Google Doc. Yes.
Oops. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, Alex, do you know if you can use your voice to add things quickly to the Apple Notes? You used to be able to do it with Google Keep.
I think you can. I don't know if I've ever done that, because then I'd have to type it again. You can do it. You can type. I think you can talk into it and it'll put something in. But the problem is usually I'm taking notes in a production, and I don't need to tell everyone what's going wrong. Like, we should have done this. We should have done this. So usually I'm quietly typing.
Oops, wrong channel.
Yeah. The one thing I will say is that I keep track of some of the things that work. Generally, my focus almost all the time is observations of things that don't work. So we didn't do this, that didn't happen, it's too cold, it's too warm, the sandwiches aren't what we should have gotten, we need more playback machines, whatever that is. It's, so usually I would never want to say it out loud, because it's generally a long string of things that I don't like.
It used to be, Google has they've moved things back and forth so much. It used to be that if I had a list in Google Keep that was like, say, my RFI list, I could just simply go into the assistant and say, add more playout machines to my RFI list. And it would add that as a line item. I don't know if that still works anymore, but it was. And
it could absolutely do it. It's just that, again, I'm usually in an environment where doing it quietly is, especially given what I'm usually typing. Like, I can't believe this is,
more.
We need more time. We need more load-in time. It's usually that kind of thing.
Got you. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, and specifically for voice, depending on which mobile platform you're on, for iOS, I have a couple shortcuts that I use. I have one that is just, hey, Siri, take a memo, but it's one that I've written, and specifically it'll work with the phone locked or not, and it'll just take whatever I say next and send me, take a message. And then if it's unlocked, you can do it so it automatically sends you an email, which I like. And that way it's always, if the priority, like Alex said, is just quickly capturing stuff and not necessarily having it organized in the best fashion, but just quickly getting that thought down so that you can move on. I love that. And the other thing I do using specifically Apple Notes is on my home screen on my phone, again, using shortcuts, I have an icon for Notes, for the Notes app, but it's specifically for just kind of one kind of scratch catch-all document. So again, I can quickly tap that, get in there, write down my note, and then later when I have time to kind of organize that stuff, put it where it maybe really belongs. That's super helpful.
Yeah, it was the thing that I really liked about it. You could just say, add such to such list. It showed up there. Next time you're looking at that list, your disparate notes, you didn't have to go around and collect. But
and for the Reminders app, that does exactly that, which is awesome. That's another way to do it potentially. Yeah, for the Reminders app.
Okay, great. Let's go to our next question.
All right, Stephen Young joins us from Orlando, and he says Dante cards for the X32 mixer are impossible to find right now. He wants to know, could you use Dante Virtual Soundcard and Loopback on a Mac to route Dante sources to a mixer via USB connection without a big latency problem? He needs this for audio on a video live stream.
Go ahead, John.
I don't know about without any additional latency. It definitely would have some processing implications over USB, especially USB 2.0, which I believe is what the X32 implements for transferring audio. I would recommend checking out Amazon. I'll post a link in chat. There is one available right now. So if you're really desperate and need it, looks like there is one available if you need to purchase it and leverage Dante the proper way.
Okay, great, good. Harshi, you have Dante experience?
No, I had a statement for the previous question, so I'll pass on.
Oh, no worries. Go to Mitchell.
I tried the virtual sound card, and it's been a little buggy on the Mac M1. They have tightened it up a wee bit on the more recent version. Generally, I would not trust it. I'd go out searching for that X32 sound card that you say is not available, but it is available on Sweetwater's website.
Okay, good news. All right, let's go to our next question.
Clive Kitchener from Sook, British Columbia in Canada asks for recommendations for Mac webcam software. He has a Brio 4K. The Logitech apps are not very granular.
Alex?
In general, none of them are very granular, but you can, webcam settings is probably the best one in my opinion. I think I've installed all of them at some point in time, and I'm the happiest with webcam settings. I think that the hard part now is going back to that as I've gotten the new Insta360 Link, and that is the state of the art software, but it only works with that camera.
Good, Mark.
So we've been covering the primaries for Maryland and Delaware. And for the Maryland primaries, we used a Brio. And it was kind of hard to get in during the Zoom meeting or prior to the meeting that we used to cover the primaries to get in and control the announcer's camera because he was remote. And then we switched to the Insta360. Much better picture, much better control. And, I could set up before the show went live. I could frame him much easier because it's remote and it moves around. I will just give everyone a word of caution. It's very small, much smaller than you would be led to believe by looking at their website. So it seems very fragile, but it's a really big improvement.
Nice. That might actually be a plus feature if you intended to, put that in front of a camera or be less obtrusive. A lot of our Brios and Avios and Huddle cams, they're massive footprints. So maybe an offset to the fragile nature. The other thing, you might try a free solution. I believe Logitech's G Suite might be able to give you some more dialed in controls. Let's go to our next question.
This time, Goran Krosai from Slovenia asks, what's the difference between 4-wire and IFB intercom for dummies?
Alex?
Yeah, so possibly nothing. so there's, typically 4-wire is what we often refer to as 4-wire, and there's a couple different definitions of 4-wire, but what we often do is standard XLR, and a lot of times that's what we're feeding to an IFB. So we're not actually. It's an IFB is what we would call an interruptible foldback, and we are often sending an XLR to that IFB, just a standard video audio out. So a lot of times there is no difference. Now you can, in some cases, send 2-wire, and 2-wire is going to be, it can be balanced. I've never actually seen it balanced. Usually 2-wire is a lot noisier than 4-wire as far as how that goes. And so from our experience in the field, but typically an IFB is getting, almost all the IFBs that we supply to talent are a standard XLR input, into those IFB transmitters.
You can balance a 2-wire?
I've read about it. I've never seen it. Okay. so it's a technically you can balance some. It in the manual it says that the 2-wire can be balanced, but I've never seen it.
Maybe
balanced.
they use a common plane or something to get that.
I don't know. I don't know how that works, but it's generally 2-wire is generally something I try to avoid.
True, very true. All right, let's go to our next question.
Peter Melvin from Houston, Texas wants to know, Blackmagic Design provides 422 image processing in their switchers. Would there be a benefit to doing 444? And how would that change things?
Go ahead, Alex.
There absolutely would be, mostly for the only place that you're going to see real benefit is in, is primarily in green screen. So if you're doing keying, that's where it's going to make the biggest difference. And it is a problem with their Ultimats that are 422 and only HD if you're actually going to output an HD signal. So if you want to think about the resolution of a 444 versus a 422, this is for what that means is there's 4 luma pixels for 2 channels of color. So basically it means that the color, this is the color here, UV, think of it in UV, not in RGB. The color is half resolution. So basically for every 4 pixels in an image, there's only 2 pixels for the color. And what we found long ago is that you can take even more color out because we pay attention. What we think is sharp and not sharp is the black and white information. So 422 works fine for most of our color information. We just wash color over it. And if it's half resolution, we don't notice because we're paying attention to the black and white information for detail. The only place it really matters is in keying, because if we're keying, we're now keying half the resolution of the image. And so that means that we will tend to right along our hairs, right along edges, we'll tend to see stair stepping. So it'll be a very subtle stair stepping, especially at HD. But there is a stair stepping because you are keying a image that is half the resolution of your display image, and that's the 422. If it's 411, which is what the old DV formats look like, that can be 1/4 of the resolution. That's why we built DV Mat long ago, was to try to take some of the Luma information and use it to correct some of the chroma information to get a better key out of it. So, but that's the main issue with 422, and it generally it just generally affects you in keying.
Thank you, Alex. Go ahead, Mitchell.
Yeah, out in the wild, you're going to see 420, 422, 444, sometimes 4444. Our lowly Alex, what am I thinking? ATEM Mini Extremes are 422. And again, in the wild, you're not going to see a lot of 444 cameras unless you go up to the tippy top, like a Sony Venice or an Arri. It takes the big boys to be able to generate that.
Yeah, I don't even know if they put their direct outputs are you can record, of course, raw and then go to 444. But I don't know if the Venice and the Arri actually output 444. They do, Mitchell, or they don't?
Yeah, you can get 444 on them. 12,
yeah, well, I think that there's an extra
camera
pack for the Venice that you have to have. I've never tried to do it with the Arri, but I think there's an extra pack on the Venice that you have to get the 444 output. The Sony 950 was the 444 before that, in the F23. I can date myself a little bit. Were the 444 outputs there.
Okay. Thank you. And let's go to our next question.
Chris Sabato in Albany, Oregon asks, other than the I/O number, are there advantages or disadvantages between using an Avio USB versus a Dante Virtual Soundcard?
All right. We have John and Mitchell weigh in on this.
Yeah, so from the Avio, think about as your input-output device, and your Dante Virtual Soundcard is your ability to route audio in and out of your PC. They don't really serve the same purpose. They could have the same purpose in mind, but really what you're thinking about is how am I going to get audio out of my computer? How am I going to get it in? Versus how am I going to route between either applications or move audio from my PC to something else within the Dante environment. This is going to be your analog in and out, your Bluetooth in and out, whatever that need is for your Dante.
Mitchell, you have something to add?
Yeah, John is absolutely correct. The Avio that Dante makes are sort of purpose-built converters. They've got analog in, analog out. They also have a digital AES EBU, and they do have a mono analog also. So they're much better in terms of making these conversions, and a whole lot less latency because of it.
All right, fantastic. Let's go to our next question.
David Paskin checks in from Miami, Florida. He says, any thoughts on evmux as a web-based streaming platform?
Go on, Tony.
So as the question says, it's a web-based application. It basically stands on the footprint of StreamYard and other such applications. It's the new kid on the block, and we'll have to play with it to just see, how much better, or if it is better than what is already existing.
Alex?
Yeah, it looks like it's probably the closest thing to StreamYard that we've seen. So that is kind of StreamYard is probably the most similar to those. The interface looks great. We haven't used it yet, so as Tony said, we're going to have to test it and play with it a little bit. Generally, with these kind of these are an improvement over other things that have been out there for someone who's just basically getting started. The real problem is the ceiling is very low. So the getting in is easy, getting off the ground and getting something started is easy, but you're usually pretty defined into the templates that you're provided for, and there's a pretty strong limitation in what you can actually do. So if you are not planning to make it any better than what you see on what they have there, then you're fine, and you'll be fine as long as you're in that most likely. If you want to be creative and want to think about new things that you want to do, you're probably better with something that is a little bit more open. So that gets into whether you're using vmix or Memo Live on Mac, on PC or Mac, or you move to an ATEM with something like MixEffect Pro. Those are going to be harder to learn. They're going to be more expensive, but maybe not over time if you're paying a monthly fee. But they're going to give you a lot more options down the road, and you'll be able to continue to innovate.
Fantastic. All right, Ken, you want to read most of our next question?
Absolutely. It goes on a bit farther than we had room for. So Michael from Ireland tells us, we have just been informed by a venue that they have limited internet bandwidth available for an event which would require 2 YouTube streams, English and French, as well as Zoom participation from remote callers. He has some issues apparently with bandwidth.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, so we don't know everything here, especially since the question got cut off mid-sentence. So, first and foremost, the obvious thing to do next is ask them to get better internet. In other words, is it simply they haven't chosen a better option, or are they truly limited by where they are, what providers are there, any physical limitations of the venue? But if it's simply a matter of this is the event they want to do, these are their needs, and they have the ability to upgrade their internet but haven't, then they should. And I'm sure Alex and others will tell you about all the mobile and wireless options and everything else, but that's certainly where I would start, is just explaining to them, if that hasn't been done, very clearly what their needs are. And again, if they have the ability to upgrade, and even if it's temporarily for that month, whatever it is, to be able to do that.
Yeah, and speaking of physical limitations, we do have a 250 character limit, fortunately, kind of fortunately, because it forces us to be a little more concise. And, sometimes if we're just a little more general, we can have a concise answer for us. Alex, you want to weigh in?
It's kind of like a haiku that you have to get I do this with Twitter all the time. I might if you look at some of my Twitter posts, most of my Twitter posts are within like 1 or 2 characters. And it's because I've rewritten it and deleted this word and then added another word and then went over again. And then I had to go back again. So that's kind of what we're forcing you to do inside of here to make sure that it works for the show. Anyway, as far as the internet, so everyone always chooses not to have more internet. It's just, there's never a possibility of I can't get more internet. It's that I'm not willing to pay for it. And so you just want to keep that in mind, is that people there's never a can't. There's just a won't in this case. We've put internet in places that we can't get cell service. We put internet in, we got internet out of Antarctica, Africa, small islands, boats, in the middle of the ocean. It can be done. It's just there are some places that you need more time, so that you can say no. Like we found that if you're on a Gulfstream 4, 150 miles east of Portland, the internet is hard. But outside of that, you need some, and all we needed was more time to install a better up dish. So you want to keep that in mind when you do it, as you talk to clients, is that they have to decide what they're willing to do. So for poor internet, the thing that you, obviously, to what Jeff said, you want to see if you can get more internet. You want to see if they can put in another provider. Depends on how much time you have. The fast way to do it is a microwave. So here in the United States, we have companies like TowerStream that we bring in, but that to get for one show, that'll cost $25,000. They used to be lower for one day. Now they only rent by the month. So they just found that everyone would still buy it. so anyway, so now it's $25,000. But what that does is a point-to-point microwave. You can also buy that point-to-point microwave. A company called Ubiquiti makes these air fiber. And those will go about 10 miles for 1 gig on the larger ones. And so then what you do is we have gone to businesses and paid them, we want to use your internet. We're going to put somebody here. We're going to put a satellite on your roof. Is that okay? We'll pay you to use it, in a pinch. With more time, obviously, we just get a provider to do it. But those are the kind of things that can be done. Now, let's just say you can't do that. What you have to do is you want to prioritize the Zoom participants coming in. When they say low bandwidth, what does that mean? Does it mean that they have 1 meg, or do they have 10 megs, or do they have 5 megs, and who else is using it? So you want to figure out, how much internet is coming to the house and how much internet is coming to you, and how much is down and how much is up. If the two participants, for instance, if you've got 50 down and 5 up, for instance, the two remote participants are not going to not get a very good connection, but you'll see them fine, right? On the way coming down. So that will work. If you have now, you may end up sending them audio back so that they can make that work. For the YouTube streams, if you have low bandwidth, the first thing you want to do is make sure only one stream is leaving the building. So you're now going to take that stream, and if you have, let's say, English and French, you're going to stack that second language onto the main stream and then get it up into the cloud. Now, if someone told us we had low bandwidth, one of the first things we would do is go to an elemental link, because we've got Zixi up to 8 channels. There's a couple other companies that make other things, but that's what we would do. You can put all the other languages up there, get it up to Media Live, and then Media Live, you split it off. You take this video with these audio channels, and that's the English one. You take this one with these other channels, and those are the French one. That way you're not doubling up your bandwidth on the way out. You're doing one stream out, and you want to have something that is like Zixi, because Zixi is going to flex with that low bandwidth. The other thing is that you want to start asking for priority. So you want to put your router, you want to be right on the WAN. So it comes into the building, it goes into an appliance that you own. You then are going to define if they prioritize the internet. Like if they think it's important for people to see the stream, and they think it's important, you want that control. And then what you're going to do is you're going to prioritize your packets. You're going to build VLANs that give the rest of the house what it gets after you get what you need. And so in some of these appliances like Meraki's, you can put like literally cell connections in them, or PEP links. You can put cell connections in there, and you hand the house, for all their internet, the cell connection, and you keep the Ethernet for yourself. So those are the kind of things that you can do to start, and it just depends on where you sit in the food chain. If getting the word out is important, then you get priority, and they'll spend money on it. And if it's not important, then they'll get what they get. So, but those are that's kind of how we tend to approach those conversations related to those things.
And Alex, for your point to point, we can maybe dwell on this a little bit, because our producers have unselfishly allowed us to spend more time on the current questions. However, if you would like to interject your question, we do have some more time for more questions. But just on that point, Alex, for the point to points, do you do anything to offer a QoS from your wireless direct point to point for those beneficiaries of internet there?
Yeah, well, we want to, if we're going to borrow the internet from somebody, we're again going to put our appliance in between their WAN so that we hand back whatever their business or house or whatever. And most people, are if you write them a large enough check, they're like, whatever, it'll be, and we're not taking away their internet. We're just making sure that we have priority over it if we're going to pay for it. Usually it's just, you're And it probably breaks their terms of service, so you always have to be kind of careful. Someone will always remind you of that as you do it. But and we've only done that probably maybe 5 or 10 times in thousands of events. Typically it's just been, we hire somebody to manage this connection. A lot of the internet providers will actually do it. There's a one here in Novato that will do that kind of thing. So those things are kind of more,
are those services something you could do impromptu, or do you already have an existing contract?
It depends. If it's a wireless, so there's a web precision web or web precision or whatever here in where I live, and they could do it in a day, if you ask them to. So there's providers, and I'm in a relatively small, not a town, but a small city. So there's oftentimes web providers. In San Francisco, there's a company called Monkey Brains. It's a horrible brand in my opinion, but they sure it sounded.
But
cool.
You remembered it. But you remember the name.
I do. I don't remember the other one. The one that in my town I don't remember, but I always remember Monkey Brains. And Monkey Brains, under some with enough money, we'll put it in quickly. And a lot of these companies with the other thing to remember is you can call AT&T, and I know this Michael's in Ireland, but we can call our providers and they'll say no, it's not available, and say, well, is there any way it could be available if we paid enough money? And then sometimes, oh yeah, it's available. Like it's kind of like from Princess Bride. I don't have the key, and it's like rip off his arms and legs. I do have the key, and so in this case, all you have to do is pay more money. So, anyways, you'll find that for $1,000, AT&T will do a lot. To get things in, you go to a different tier of customer really quickly, and so again, what we're accustomed to is talking to our clients about like how important, because you have to remember that. It depends on the size of your event. If you have a little event with 30 people and everyone's walking up to a podium and there's just someone who's an MC that's just kind of telling them what to do, you may not have the budget to do a lot of the things that I'm talking about. But remember that the event that they're doing probably costs $20, $30, $50, $100, $1 million to do. Like whatever that number is, they are prioritizing that event over the stream, and they just need to know that the stream might not go well. The biggest thing is to be, you don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but you do want to, you want to make sure that you are clear with folks that they are, that they're at risk. Like that's your protection, and you want to do that in email. Of like, hey, we're really worried about this. These are the things that may happen in the stream. We may see a breakup. We may see stalling. We may get echo. We may get, there's all these, like, if we don't get better bandwidth, these are the risks. We're willing to move forward, but these are the risks that you run if we go forward without enough bandwidth. And you want that in email, because that's the email that you send back when something goes wrong and they're very upset.
And Alex, are you offering sort of a more degraded experience as a recommendation to do, maybe drop more features or less throughput? Yeah,
I mean, we'll just tell them what we think we're comfortable with, and I will admit that I work on some pretty high profile events, and my appetite for failures or my appetite for risk is very low. So if I need to see 20 megs a second up and down for every Zoom participant. like that's what I want. Like that's what I want allocated, and I want that on a separate VLAN. And I want like I'm pretty aggressive about we need, because you never get what you asked for, and you never get it never has that kind of throughput. So you always have to ask for more than what you need. And so those are the things that we and if we don't get those things, there's a whole lot of warnings that go out that things could go wrong, because you need to be able to, during fluctuation, you need to be able to manage that flow.
Do you ever do more than one hop when you're doing a point to point, or is it usually just a direct jump?
I've never done more than one. The systems are totally capable of that. I mean, that's how they work. So the a lot of the wireless systems are definitely capable of multiple hops, sometimes 3, 4, 5 hops, out. And if you use a link runner, sometimes you can see it. If you do pings, you can see that it's hopping a couple times, through there. But when I've done ad hoc networks, we have not done that.
And when you're looking around for bandwidth, how do you know how much bandwidth there is to get? If someone decides to help you out with that, do you test it first and then report that to your client?
Well,
about
first we
what
find
you
out
have
what,
available?
I mean, again, we've only done it a handful of times, so it's not something that's a regular thing for us. We usually try to go for, medium-sized businesses. Large businesses have IT departments that will not allow it. Small businesses generally have cheap internet. And so you're looking kind of a medium-sized business, oftentimes tech-related, are the ones that typically are going to have that. So that's what you're searching for. And then when you find them, you want to find out who's their provider. If it's Spectrum, you just ignore them. And what you're looking for. And then you want to do obviously tests to make sure that it's working. Yeah.
All right. And John, you have a thought? We can't hear you, John.
I apologize. Defining the SLAs within the contract, I think, are very important. And just making sure you understand testing, what does that look like, peak hours, making sure it's the same time of the day, understanding what their network load typically looks like. All those can really determine if they have the capability to provide what you're looking for.
And to underline, for most things that we're doing, we have two ways out. So this would just be one of our two solutions. We would very rarely depend on somebody's business or house for a single connection from a major event. Usually the secondary, this is the secondary output from something else. Our preference is generally fiber with a backup of satellite. But we will, if we go into one of these things, usually there's a cellular backup that we use, and our most common cellular backup is a live view. So but that's usually our backup to another connection with some way to roll over. Usually, we've kind of moved to rolling over at the head end. So what we do is we'll send both of those feeds back to a control room. And so we want to roll over not on the far end, but on the, at a core where we're retransmitting. So we're not going to the cloud. We're going from two connections to somewhere that we can view the signal and make a manual adjustment. Otherwise, small glitches end up popping over to the backup prematurely, which is usually not a great thing.
Yeah, and John, do you want to define the SLA for us?
A service level agreement. That's essentially defining, hey, I'm going to get at least this much, and making sure it's not like your cable agreement where you could get as most of whatever. Like, hey, I need at least 20 by 20 or a gig by a gig. And then how you're going to hold them accountable. JJ in the chat, like using iPerf to actually transfer information, using UDP versus TCP so you can understand what the actual loss is, understanding what the network topology is, getting any sort of network diagrams. All those are really critical to understand what exactly you're going to get and how much bandwidth you can expect on a continuous basis.
All right, thank you. This is kind of a critical thing. Not having internet really puts a burden on your virtual productions. And our producers have stepped up, so we've had more questions. So we'll move on and we'll try and get them in before our education hour.
I actually want to add one more thing to that. If you had to do one thing, the Zoom, you have your Zoom stuff and get a satellite truck for the stream, because the easiest thing for you to do is get a sat truck and just have it go out. And it's $4,000 or $5,000 to do that. It's not 20 to do the connection. But if you had enough bandwidth to do the Zoom and your event is a priority for your client, almost anywhere in the world, you can get a sat truck to show up and take your signal and put it up, and then you downlink it and stream it to YouTube from there.
Very good. And if you know that upfront cost, you can present that to the client.
You just give them options. You just give them options. Yeah.
Next question.
Speaking of options, David Paskin from Miami, Florida asks, will audio quality increase if I go out from an audio interface into a mixer using a 1/4 inch to XLR cable versus just 1/4 inch to 1/4 inch cable?
Go ahead, Mitchell.
Well, it depends. If that 1/4 inch cable is a 2-wire or a 3-wire, if it's 2-wire, it means it's unbalanced, and that's bad, especially if you go into an XLR. And if it's 3-wire, then it means it's probably balanced or symmetrical. There is a patch cable, 1/4 inch, and that's a tip ring sleeve. So that's a 3-wire connection. And that will be compatible into an XLR if you choose to use that. But generally, we don't like to mix unbalanced with balanced without some type of device in between to properly balance that, whether that's a transformer or some type of a DI box. So the cable choice is not so important as the number of wires or whether or not it's balanced or unbalanced going to and fro.
Ken?
Yeah, what he said. And in a perfect world, no, there wouldn't be any difference at all. But the world isn't perfect. And typically, balanced signals respond better to imperfections than unbalanced signals do. So if you keep it short, that is, that long, that should probably be okay in the matter of inches. But when you get to feet lengths, well, then I would consider seriously going into a balanced arrangement.
Good point. Alex?
Yeah, I thought Ken's length explanation of being about an inch long, I still think that might be a long cable for an unbalanced aside I just want to say. But aside that.
And Mitchell?
Yeah, I was just going to point out, if you hear a huge drop in volume when you use a Frankenstein to cable, it means that they just shorted the wires together for a 2-wire system, and that's just really sloppy way to do it.
All right, let's go to our next question.
Paul Valhos from Austin, Texas asks us to comment on the impact of the FiLMiCPro and Bending Sppols, SPPOLS, merger and new subscriptions model.
I believe he meant spoons on that. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, businesses really enjoy staying in business. And so for whatever reason, FiLMiCPro decided that its best option to continue to stay in business and make money was to, one, merge with this other company, as well as turn into a subscription pricing model. And one of the main reasons why is with a subscription, businesses can forecast and estimate what their future income will be. And it's really helpful if your main expense is employees, which are a recurring expense, to have an idea of what your recurring revenue will be. And they'll probably lose some business. I won't be subscribing to it, though I might have paid for an in-app purchase. But on the other hand, they'll have a more consistent revenue stream that they can count on for a longer period of time. And they've decided that that's valuable to them.
Alex?
The biggest problem with a company like FiLMiCPro is they actually added too many features all at one time. So there was no reason to update, so you get it and you don't really need to buy an update for it because it does almost all the things that it needs to do. Now you're waiting for Apple to do something new that you can do an update that you can charge for. The update process inside of the App Store is not great. To buy another upgrade it's kind of painful, and so that I think that's part of the problem there. And again, it's one of those things you're still doing. You need to have revenue to constantly be updating. So if you don't have something that you can keep on adding to, and especially if you're in a system that's limited to what the phone can do, it's very hard to keep a business in place. I think that it's an interesting mix of being able to capture things really effectively and then also being able to edit them. So Splice as an app, there's some pretty interesting possibilities of what you could be able to do with this. And you really could get to almost a full-featured filmmaking, kind of like what you would see in-app in TikTok or in-app in something else. Having the filmic controls with an editing package and effects package all built into one thing means that it's really good for social media content generation because someone can just do it on the fly and they can really customize those solutions, but give them a really high quality video input. So I think it's actually a pretty interesting merger.
Yeah, I kind of wonder how some of these freemium, products are able to stick around. They offer so much, and it's so tempting to not buy them.
Volume. Sorry, there was a Saturday Night Live about. Have you ever seen the change? You give me 25 cents, I'll give you two dimes and a nickel. How do we make money? Volume. So it's just like eventually it has to turn. But eventually you have to get a penny out of that.
Yeah. Gotcha. All right. Let's go to our next question.
All right. Douglas Carmichael asks, for meetings and video calls and other general use, would a headset mic like the DPA 4488 or 4088 give clearer audio than a mic on a desk arm? How would you protect a delicate headset like the 4488 or 4088?
John?
A clearer audio, I think you'd be fine if you're using a DPA headset. I don't think it's necessary. I think you would get a fuller sound using a larger diaphragm microphone than you would from a small diaphragm on the side of your head. I would also just make sure that you're getting a directional mic and not a omnidirectional, especially in sort of a desk setting. It would pick up a lot of extra noise from around you that you would not want in your signal. And then as far as protection goes, the headsets, the cases that they come with, or a third-party case is what I would prefer. Definitely a delicate capsule on those, and you want to make sure you're putting it away after each use.
And Alex?
Yeah, so you'll definitely have a clearer sound with a desktop mic if you use it well. So if you move in and out like this, then it's not going to be as clear as it was before. And if you're walking around and needing both your hands and needing to move around, I think that you definitely a headset mic works well. And when we give it to people who aren't trained, we tend to give them headset mics, but they can be a little bit harder to put on. I tend to lean against the directionals, actually, the cardioids and the supercardioids. And the reason is because the sibilance is so bad. So the omnidirectional will sound more natural and you'll have less sibilance, which is already a problem with the small receivers that are already there. So we find that the directional and omnidirectional, the cardioids and hypercardioids on the headsets tend not to sound good when they're working. The omnis have more challenges, as John pointed out, of picking up things around you. So
let's go to our next question.
James Foslin, Sam Greenwood in Toronto. What's a good small form factor, approximately the size of an Insta360 360 camera that has HDMI to be used with an ATEM Mini?
John, do you know of one?
I don't know of one except for getting an Insta360 and plugging into the HDMI adapters that you kind of see around. I don't see a camera really that size. Marshall makes a lot of small cameras that are okay, but you're really sacrificing quality when you're going to a sensor size that small.
Yeah, agreed. And Alex?
Yeah, the Insta360 Link Pro is really the one that you want. Unfortunately, that only exists in my mind. so anyway, we really want that. I had everybody going. Everybody was typing there for a second. So anyway, that's the one we want is that, and $100 more, and that would probably sell as many as they could make. The Huddle Cam is probably the next best one. So it's a little bit larger than the Link 360, but it has a remote control as well as USB and HDMI. It's probably the closest to the form factor that you're looking for.
Yeah, I have the Avio, which is basically the same thing as a Huddle Cam. It is a much wider form factor, I will say. It has HDMI and USB, but I don't know, maybe Mark, do you know of something maybe a little small?
Yeah, what I was thinking of was using a USB hub that's powered. So you could then plug that into the Instalink 360, get the HDMI out of it, and to power the Instalink 360, just use a wall wart to bring power into that hub. And I think that would, be a way to get the HDMI out of that camera.
Okay. I will say that for some of these cameras that have a real value add, like the Insta360 Link with the PTZ option, you're kind of throwing that all away if you're not running it into a computer first. You can get a B-Link, a relatively inexpensive computer that has an HDMI output, and then be able to utilize that PTZ function and then run that into your ATEM. It means adding an extra computer to your setup as opposed to an adapter. So maybe just think about it that way. Let's go to our next question.
Sam Green, James Foslin from Minneapolis says, I have the Arturia keystep 37. That is a sequencer with control voltage. Are there any recommendations if I want to get into modular synths?
Go ahead, Alex.
I would recommend asking this on Tuesday. So on a Saturday morning, there's not a lot of us that are synth aficionados. Some of us have synths, some of us play with them, but I think you'll get a more definitive answer on Tuesday morning. Oftentimes, Carl Asmussen, who is much more deeper into that, is there on Tuesday, and sometimes we have other synthesizer experts. So I would come on Tuesday.
Yeah, we definitely have a wealth of knowledge there. And we have some very interesting audio topics, too, that tend to bring out some of our audio professionals.
Yeah, between we had one a couple of weeks ago. We had Carl, we had Nick Batt, Courtney, a bunch of people that really, really understand these things. And we'll be doing more synthesizer second hours as well.
All right, let's go to our next question.
Jeff Cohen from Miami Beach, Florida says, thoughts on posting audio-only voiceover demos on my website as YouTube videos versus the typical SoundCloud and so forth. Thinking is using the same platform for both video demos and audio-only. Also, opportunity for minimal, non-distracting on-screen messaging.
What do you think, Alex?
I highly recommend it. Yeah, I think that you see a lot of folks putting stuff up that is just a graphic, and then it's their audio samples, and especially because people can listen to it, and it's much easier for people to go find it. If you give them a link to something like YouTube, it's very easy for them to jump up to, and you're absolutely correct that you can put a little graphic up there. My favorite audio only on all of YouTube is the Gringo. Just do a Gringo rendition of Just Like Heaven from The Cure, which is some mariachi version of Just Like Heaven. It's literally the best audio only thing, in my opinion, on all of YouTube. So I highly recommend checking it out.
Go ahead, Mitchell.
Yeah, for audio only on our website, we use embedded YouTube. Works fine.
I'm a YouTube Premium subscriber, and it amazes me of just how much audio, if I just want audio, then the video just comes along with it with YouTube search engine. It's ridiculous. And with YouTube Premium, they have to where you don't have that screen on a mobile device and just be able to listen to the audio. But like, I've not been able to not find anything on YouTube in an audio sense. Jeff, you have something to add? I think you're muted there, Jeff.
Sorry, and that's the only actual concern is I'm spoiled as a YouTube Premium user, and so the only concern, depending on where someone might share it or something like that, is then a normal user running into a pre-roll commercial or worse, some kind of mid-roll or something like that.
I think that if you turn off monetization, I don't think that'll happen.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Good. So if you're not looking to make money on your actual demos, then you can clean. I'm pretty sure you can turn that off, but yeah, we'll have to see if someone knows. Put it in the Makana chat if I'm incorrect. Let's go to our next question.
Gordon Lake from Los Angeles, California. When going into an ATEM, what would be the difference between a Zoom ISO 8 output setup or using 8 laptops, one for each panelist?
Go ahead, John.
The difference would be pretty significant. If you're going 8 laptops, one for each panelist, I think of 8 separate Zoom meetings and then having to route the audio from each meeting to each other. And then the added latency that would be there for each different conversation happening is the extra round trip everything's taking from a network perspective. Zoom ISO would be joining that computer to a meeting, pulling the 8 outputs into the ATEM, and then mixing from one meeting, which is what we do here. And it's definitely much more of a cohesive conversation. You can definitely do it a different way if you want to and do different breakout rooms, however you wanted to handle that. But I would definitely recommend the Zoom ISO route versus 8 different laptops pulling. Not to mention all the audio routing that would be sort of a nightmare on top of that.
Alex?
So for the last, 4 or 5 years, we've used a separate computer for each person in O9O, but we use Zoom ISO here for the office hours. The reason we still use it for O9O is specifically for custom returns. So being able to have a custom return video, custom return audio, so we have basically talk back to every individual, and we're able to just kind of identify them. Now that's maybe at some point that will no longer be a problem for us, using Zoom. But right now, even with Zoom ISO, we would still not be able to talk back to each participant in the current setup. And so that's the disadvantage. But all the advantages that John outlined is one of the reasons that we're looking heavily at just moving, over to Zoom ISO. And I'm going to be testing it heavily with the Michael Krasny show, where we're going to have the 8 outputs from one Mac Mini into an Extreme all SDI. Being able to use Mix Effect Pro, being able to I'm even looking at like channel, Mix Bus, and so on and so forth, basically to do everything. And we'll be testing Mimo Live as well using Siphon to get it into there. And so having it all kind of embedded into a system. So those are the things that we're going to be doing a lot of experimentation with ISO. But as soon as we're able to talk back, the custom video is nice, but the talk back is really important for a lot of our shows. So as soon as we're able to talk back to the guests directly, I think we'll move on to Zoom ISO completely.
Yeah, that would be a fantastic feature. And we did have with our Zoom feature them saying that this eliminates a lot of the need for the farms, the pinning farms. But Mickey makes a good point too, kind of what Alex was talking about, your return feeds. So one machine can pull a bunch of feeds out, But let's say, for example, that they're all in different breakout rooms. Well, then you would need different machines to be able to facilitate that.
And the latency really is an issue. But the main thing is that there's other ways to do it. Like if you're sending a kit to somebody with let's say a Mac Mini, you could put Unity on it and you can run it. But having what we would consider a civilian trying to run Unity on their system is not something that we would recommend.
Okay. And Mickey's advice to the chat, learn mix minuses for your return feeds. Let's go to our next question.
Oh, Cordell, Charleston, South Carolina. Could we effect a second hour or lab to discuss and work through networking settings such as QoS and IGMP snooping, as well as how and what to monitor during a show?
Can we, John? Can we?
I think we can, and I think we should have JJ host it because there's very few people who know more than he does when it comes to networking. I would love to see him get out from behind the stage and speak a little bit what his passion is.
JJ, we're calling you out. Go ahead, Alex.
Yes, JJ. So we'll we should definitely we'll work on getting a lab done. We'll talk to JJ about it and find out when he might be able to do one.
Love the idea for IT. IT is basically, networking specific is something that all of our production has to consider. So we have a team specifically focused on these different topics. So we'll have to leverage that and see what we can do. Let's go to our next question.
Chris Widener, Lafayette, Indiana, says now that Starlink is offering their Pro dish, the $2,500 US one, on the residential plans at $110 a month, is anyone upgrading?
Alex?
So tempted, but I'm not utilizing my current one enough because I just don't have it in the right position. So until I get that one really running, I'm decided not to add another one. But the pro version does look pretty tempting.
I'd love to have a reason to do it. John?
Does that remove the location limits as well as bandwidth preference?
You can remove the location limit now from any of them. You just pay an extra $10 or $15 a month, but so that's the location stuff isn't a problem, and I think you can even have it moving and it will still work at this point. That stuff was that was being tested for a while, so it's pretty robust, so I think that those things you can do that with either one. I think it's the amount of bandwidth and stability of the Pro one is a bit higher than, so it's really for more mission critical events.
Next question.
Douglas Carmichael joins us. What would you recommend as a modern equivalent to the classic Apple Front Row Media Center interface on macOS?
John?
Plex, especially if you have a machine that's running 24/7.
Thank you. John?
I agree, Plex. There's a lot of great solutions out there to run it on different NAS platforms as well. Definitely going to provide an even better experience than the Apple Front Row.
Do you notice how I enunciated the difference between John and John? Let's go to our next question.
I heard the H.
Peter Moore from Auckland, New Zealand comes back in to ask, what keyboards or synth does John Wallace have there over his left shoulder?
John, I believe you're the best person to answer this question.
Yeah, that is a Arturia. I don't even know how to pronounce it. It was a keyboard that my friend had that wasn't using, and I purchased it. So I don't play keys often. I actually have to do it tomorrow at the Sunday place, but so I just have it here. So whenever I need to lay down something, I can use it. And unfortunately, it's in some sort of sleep mode and flashing all over the place. So that's good.
I like it. I like the distraction, although the frame rate isn't quite up to snuff for those keys. Let's go to our next question.
Tony Mobley, Newnan, Georgia. Alex and panel, if because of the changes to FiLMiCPro, should I consider Shoot app? And will it work the way I'm currently using FiLMiC in back of the teleprompter and ATEM Mini?
Alex?
Yeah, I think that moving to subscription is actually a big boom for Shoot. so I think that people will be moving over. The good news is that if it doesn't do what you need it to do, Michael Forrest is actually in our community. So I'm sure that we have found him to be very responsive to what we're doing. So I would go ahead and give Shoot a try for what you're doing. And if it doesn't work, you can find him on Discord.
That's right. And wink, wink, you may see him a little sooner as well on the show. Let's go to our final question of the first hour.
Douglas Carmichael again. In an article about the trucks Game Creek Video built for Amazon Prime Video, Thursday Night Football, they mentioned that the main truck, Prime 1, has 5 units, A through E. What does that mean? One name for 5 separate trucks?
Alex?
Actually, I'm not sure how they're defining units, but a lot of these shows do have multiple trucks that are going on, and some of them aren't full-size double expandos. They're smaller trucks that are doing other things. They might have audio pushed out into one. They might have EVS pushed out into another. They might have, a lot of different things that are broken out. So I don't have that particular answer directly, but one of these shows oftentimes can have 8 to 12 trucks total, or as few as 4 or 5 trucks that are there that are managing different aspects of the show. These are pretty big productions, and you want to note that they built these just for these shows. It gives you a sense of the scale. The last numbers that I've heard on average for these trucks for the cost of building one is in the $8 to $10 million range. So these are big, these trucks are at a whole different level. And I will say that we'll probably do another kind of graphics day looking at the graphics. Again, some people don't like them. Some people like them. I didn't like them at first. Now I like them. But I still think now Thursday night above Sunday night is probably, Sunday night and Thursday nights are the 2 high water marks for sports production as far as graphics go.
And that was our final question of the first hour. Thank you, all the producers, for asking the questions. We went through 55,832 miles, 89,853 kilometers. Maybe we'll get a graphic sometime. But thank you for the great discussion. Now we're going to transition into our second hour. Today, we're going to reboot our education hour. So we have John Snyder here for the education hour, and we'll let him introduce himself. John, what are you going to talk about, and why should we stick around and support the education hour?
Absolutely. Thanks, Josh. And first of all, thank you to everyone on the back end also who's making office hours possible, and for producers for asking those great questions. In a moment, we're going to roll our credits, and you'll see the tremendous effort and innovation that goes into making our show possible. And then after a short break, approximately 5 to 10 minutes, we'll start with our first education hour. Today, it's going to be helpful for anyone who has to pass knowledge on to others. For you who are experienced teachers, what if I told you that the most powerful tool in your toolbox is something that you already know how to use, but most of us neglect? And for those of you who are informal teachers or have to pass some other type of knowledge off to other people, what if I told you that taking 1 hour to learn one skill will make your training more effective than any other trick? As Josh mentioned, after our break, our education hour will return. We'll spend about an hour with a brief instruction by me, and then we'll discuss how you can create effective learning objectives, the most powerful tool in your toolbox. And while you're all waiting for the teachers to come on, and again, any of you panelists who are currently on, feel free to stay. I'd like everyone who's in the audience, all of our producers, to consider what's one goal that you hope to achieve after watching our second hour. And how will you know that you've achieved it? In other words, what's your personal learning objective? And once you have your goal, please put it into the chat because we'll be discussing that when we come back in approximately 5 or 10 minutes. Good morning, Emily, Aaron, Chris.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I believe our audio is streaming. This part will be edited out in the recording, but just be aware of that. Josh, any ideas on how best way to do? Did you all do sound checks backstage? Cool. We also do not have a reader that I'm aware of. Volunteers?
Oops, sorry, I'm muted. Good morning, everyone.
Many years of experience educating humans from every age and demographic today. To start, let's have each of the panelists briefly introduce yourselves, including what comes to mind when I say learning objectives. Are they critical infrastructure or something that you would rather not have to do? How about you, Erin?
Okay, good morning, John. So I've been an educator for about 12 years. And when I think about objectives, I first think about my college days where we had to write very specific lesson plans that were super detailed. And while they were very helpful at the beginning, I feel like learning objectives now can change and be a lot more simplified and broken down for kids to be able to understand so that they can really access what we're talking about. So instead of a very lengthy learning objective, it's a lot more shortened. An example that I used yesterday in my class is today we're going to be rounding to the nearest 10 using a number line. So we all had number lines and we were able to use that learning objective by the end to test that they were able to do it by the end of the lesson. So when you simplify it, I think it's a lot easier to use.
Thank you. Chris?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Chris Clark, calling in from Tempe, Arizona. I've been an educator for 45 or 50 years. So I was active in education and higher education when Benjamin Bloom was still around, and I have the honor of having shaken his hand and met him during my graduate education. And I knew some of his former students who became professors of mine. So I'm sort of genetically connected in a way to the originator or popularizer of one of the systems for describing objectives. What comes to mind is that Benjamin Bloom was very short. He was shorter than I was, and so I always think about that. Lately, or in recent years, I've been much more of a higher education person, but earlier in my career, I was a researcher on teaching, and much of my work was done in elementary school classrooms collaboratively with elementary school teachers, focusing at first on the teaching of writing, which was in those days somewhat neglected, not handwriting, but the composition of thoughts and ideas. And I suppose it still is, has a reputation for being a neglected discipline in early education. I'm a funny guy most of the time, so I like to bring levity to the party. That's
awesome.
all.
Thank you. And we'll be talking a little bit about Benjamin Bloom and his work in the field. But first, Emily, what's your experience with learning objectives?
Hi, Emily Russo. I was a, a high school English teacher for 6 years or 6.5 years. Then I was a technology coach for 7 years. And then I left and I'm working in the private sector now for about a year. And when I hear learning objectives, my skin crawls a little bit because I had a administrator when I first started teaching who made us write them on the board every day, and she checked to see that we changed them. And it was the dreaded swab. Students will be able to, and then the bracket, and it was the Bloom's verb and what they're going to be able to do. So being forced to do that every day, I felt it was reductive. And I taught high school, and my students would read them and they felt that it was very condescending to see it on the board to them, which we could talk about later. But yeah, so my experience with learning objectives is like, I know the value of a learning objective. And as an educator, I know that I need to have a goal and I need to be able to measure that goal. But sometimes I think, we've turned it into a formula that needs to be followed, and it's not really contributing to the learning and growth of our students. So that's where I stand on it.
Should be a fun conversation then. Alex?
It's such a great, it's good to see all, by the way, all the educators we haven't seen for a little while. My background, of course, is that I loved learning growing up, still love learning, but I just didn't like school that much. Most of my life has been trying to close that gap. What was it about school that I didn't like, but I was not someone that didn't like learning. I was absorbing massive amounts of information. I just didn't like the format. And so I've spent a large portion of my life trying to figure that out and close that gap a little bit. I think one of the things that I focus on a lot, and I mostly deal with media as it relates to school. So I have helped start a school in Rwanda that we've pushed. We've had about 400 or 500 students go through, and for training. And then I've sat on the board of a couple other schools, which is kind of funny because I don't have a degree in anything. Anyway, so when I think of one of the things that I almost will never talk about learning outcomes with students. So this is exactly what Emily talked about. I feel that it is, and with anything, we learn how to do something and then we try to systematize it. And usually in the process of systematizing something, we take all the life out of it, and I think that is the challenge that we really have. And I think that when I think about learning objectives, usually my objective is to make someone useful in a certain area. Like they're actually useful. Having them hold information in their head is not something that I worry about that much because they have Google. So they can Google this. They have great calculators. They can just type those things in. So memorizing things, the key to having things in your head is to be able to process them quickly. So for instance, the most valuable thing I learned in any math class, now I learned a lot about math, but usually outside of class. But the most valuable thing that I learned was how to do my times tables up to 12 by 12 to a point where I could do them in muscle memory. And I use that every day. Like I use that, I don't use I can't remember most of the other stuff, but I use that every day. And so, and it speeds up my ability to think through things because of that. And so I think about those, like they need the information in their head for these reasons. And this makes them useful in this area. And I've tried to absorb lots of information all the time. But I think that when we start making it a learning objective, exactly what Emily and Aaron were talking about, and Chris, it starts to show too much of the back end, too much of the, what's behind it. And we just, the key is I think it takes a lot of the joy out of it for the students. It becomes something that they have to do as opposed to we're going to explore. The best teachers that I had in school were ones that we were exploring ideas and we really didn't think much about what the objectives are. But when we got to the other end, we knew it.
Great. How about Josh?
Well, I am hoping to learn about Bloom's taxonomy today. I've not been not had to run into it, so I'm curious as to how that works. As far as having learning objectives, that's kind of the only way that I learn. I think I'm kind of the same way with traditional learning, the same antithesis that perhaps Alex expressed. And my own personal run-in with schooling was that didn't really like my ability not to be able to see the purpose of why we were doing something really hurt my academics. And it wasn't until I started into vocational training that I was an honor student because I saw the purpose and learned that. So I've done a lot of practical training for other people. And what I like to try to show them or put them in a situation is, here, you have this problem. And now what do you need to know so that you can solve this problem? What fundamental skills or lessons now that you have a need to learn so that you can solve this problem?
Thank you. Harshi. Cannot hear you.
Hershey, you are Zoom muted.
That could have fixed a lot of problems there. And here we are, and I just want to welcome everybody back to the Education Hour. And where I look at objectives as personally is, what does it mean to me specifically? Because I have vision loss. So what are the objectives? Why is the instructor giving me this project to do? And what is my intent to learn? I am not familiar with the Bloom's taxonomy as much, but I'm always teaching assistive technology, even though I'm having to learn it for myself. So I kind of take it as a twofold. How do we take information and deliver it to people where they're interested? And after interest, how are they going to retain that information? I come from Africa. I was born in Zambia, and I was in 5th grade in Zambia. When I came to the States, I was not. I was put down in a lower grade. But what is the difference there, right? Where can we improve education and retention? And the other aspect I look at is, when we do get vocational, how do we actually show our results? How do we take our applied skills and put them to the test? So, even if it's education, how do we capture the essence of children? How do we capture the essence of adolescents or adults? It all matters. So I'm here to kind of learn from you all with your knowledge, and maybe I have some knowledge I could share.
Thanks. Ken.
Well, good day, everyone. It's nice to be here and to see the reboot of the Education Hour. I don't have formal education training, but of course I've been taught stuff all through my life, and occasionally I have the requirement to teach other people some of the few things that I know. As far as Bloom is concerned, the only one I know is in my garden out here behind the curtain, and they're not doing all that well. So I could stand to have a lot of education in several different points. In terms of learning objective, my military training always taught me that we taught in groups of 3, and we began with the phrase, "Tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them." And so there were three things we were going to discuss today, and they were point A, point B, and point C. And in point A, we're going to learn about this, this, and this. And then we would learn about those three things, and then we would recap them at the end so that even though we might have been asleep during the meat of the presentation, we were reminded again what we should have been paying attention to by the time the class was over. So small bites of easily digested material is what I look for in learning objectives. Thanks for allowing me to be here.
Awesome. Tony?
Just want to say it's so good to see everyone here today. I missed you guys. My name is Tony Mobley. I have been in education on and off over the last 30 years. I started out as a long-term supply teacher when I graduated from college, and I worked as a supply teacher for 3 years. I was in the classroom for every day. And then I moved on to a lot of other different kinds of jobs, most of them nonprofit, and ended up back in education probably the last 10 years that I was in working in education. And I did a lot of different jobs and ended up working as a high school autism teacher for low functioning students. And the objectives that I had to work with over those last 3 years was that I had to help them. The objectives was to be fully functional and to learn social skills and personal care skills. And so my perspective is a little bit different in terms of the objectives, because the idea was that they would be help them to be as independent as possible. And so that was my experience. And I consider myself a lifelong student. And since I haven't worked in actual classroom since 2013, I just consider myself a lifelong student who continues to try to be in this atmosphere to continue to try to learn more things.
Great, and thank you all very much. My name is John Snyder, like I said, and I'll be hosting today. My personal experience is I've been in education of some form or fashion for the last 20 years or so, primarily in adolescent education. At the start of my career, I was a substitute teacher. I worked in a church environment, so I've done formal and informal teaching. And most recently, for the last 6 years, I've been a trainer and then a training manager of a hospital call center. And the reason I wanted to start with learning objectives, even though it's something really elementary, is because it's also really fundamental, especially when you're in a corporate environment or if you're limited in your time that you have for your audience. And just because it's fundamental doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. Michael Jordan practiced shooting 500 jump shots a day in the summertime. But us teachers and educators, we don't practice the fundamentals when we're designing our teaching. And when you're designing teaching to be delivered in a virtual environment, every second, whether it's recording a video or teaching through Zoom or any other format of digital teaching, every second has to serve the purpose of the lesson. And every second has to engage your learners. Because in a virtual environment, you're competing with the screen. You're competing with people's emails, with the entire compendium of human knowledge in Wikipedia. And you have to be more interesting and engaging than whatever's going to distract your learners. So a learning objective, for those of you who don't know, I'm going to just quickly describe what they are and how to build them. They're a descriptive goal that explains the purpose of your lesson. They're oftentimes a requirement when you're developing curriculum in a formal sense. And different contexts have different uses of learning objectives. In the corporate world, it's really about what will my learner be able to do differently as a result of this that will add value to the business. In a school, your objective might be teach my kid how to do times tables. Either way, when you think about it, effective learning objectives, when used appropriately, they really help you guide the development of your curricula. They help you define the rails that you want to drive down. They help you see, like, what do I want to achieve as a result of this? And because of that, they help you maintain the scope of your project. You don't want to add anything extra, especially in a virtual environment, to your training or education than the learner needs to know. And lastly, they need to be they really help you, I should say, they help you assess that the learning has taken place. Because if learning hasn't taken place, well, then you've failed your learners and you've wasted everyone's time. So this is what learning objectives do. But if you wanted to put it a different way and describe what effective learning objectives are like, is they're clear and specific. They have, like Emily was saying, a verb, an object, and a degree. And by the way, the degree thing is something you typically see more in a corporate environment. And an example would be, if I'm teaching someone how to fly a plane, the degree of success is they need to be able to land successfully 100% of the time. Whereas on the other hand, if I'm training a call center representative how to update someone's address, I only need them to be able to successfully update someone's address 75% of the time. So in practical training, your objectives are always tied to some specific outcome, and they should be, it helps you structure your learning. It's the skeleton that your learning is built upon. And the history of learning objectives goes back pretty far. I think Dr. Clark mentioned Bloom, and Benjamin Bloom was back in the 50s. In 1956, he created something called Bloom's Taxonomy. And what Bloom's Taxonomy is it's a hierarchical model of cognitive skills. So it's a way of layering how much someone learns based off of how it's an attempt to measure how deep someone's learning is. It's been iterated over the years, and the most recent iteration simplified some of the language as well as turned the categories into verbs instead of nouns. And the idea is that for best results, you want to use different levels of Bloom's taxonomy to demonstrate that different levels of learning have been achieved. So you should be able to see Bloom's taxonomy here. And you can see that the lowest level of Bloom's taxonomy is remembering. And this is the idea that after finishing training, your learners will be able to recite or remember something like that. They'll have a basic understanding of the content. Slightly above that is understanding, and I always get these two confused. Understanding is not just be able to reiterate what someone said, but to really describe what someone said, to almost be able to think about what someone said in a deeper level than just parrot it back. And then you have your apply phase, which is the ability to take that learning and paint it onto some new situation, the ability to do things like forecast a future result based off of something in the past. Analyzing is being able to break down information into smaller chunks. And once you have it broken down into smaller chunks and you understand how the chunks work together, you can evaluate and compare two different objects from each other. And lastly, theoretically, the highest level in Bloom's taxonomy is the create level. With those little parts, can you take all the stuff you've learned, combine it back together, remix it, and make something new? And so teachers are taught the best learning is stuff that goes to the create level. And there is some critique to Bloom's, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But for best results, you want to use different levels of Bloom's taxonomy to demonstrate that deeper learning has been achieved. And again, it really depends on your context. If I'm teaching somebody compliance training, like the importance of HIPAA laws, I do need them to pass a test regarding the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. I might want them to remember that HIPAA stands for the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. But what I need them to be able to do differently is I need them to protect our patients' privacy. And so I want my learners, what I want them to do is to be able to apply it to their job. But what I might need from a compliance perspective is to prove that they can remember it. And so it really becomes a push and pull and a dance between the objective and the content. They're especially helpful when you're preparing for an assessment. And what I find is that when I write clear and specific learning objectives, it's much, much easier to write an assessment. An assessment is just some way to measure the results. In school, you probably had pop quizzes, or maybe you did projects, and those were assessments to see how much you learned. Same in the corporate world. You might do e-learning modules when you first start a new job that assesses whether or not you retain the content. In real life, like most of us said, we learn so that we can do something new. And a learning objectives helps you identify what that thing you want to do is, and how will you assess that you can do it. Because really the purpose of any learning, if you think about it, the purpose of education is to make change. Either you want someone to learn something new, to learn how to do something new, and even if you're teaching yourself, you want something to change. So a common framework for writing your objectives is to start with, after this lesson, and Emily said this, our learners will be able to blank, and you have some sort of verb. To what degree, X percentage of the time, and then how will you know that that's taken place? One thing that I really like to do when I'm starting a lesson plan is to sit down and say, what do I want to be different after taking my training versus before taking my training. And that's what gives me the objectives. And when I know the objective of training as the teacher, I can design my outline. I can choose training activities, and I can flesh out the parts of my training that need to be fleshed out. And rather than using Bloom's taxonomy in a hierarchical model, I personally prefer to use something like this. And if you're having a hard time seeing this, on the screen you see a wheel, and in the middle wheel are the 6 different layers of Bloom's taxonomy. And in the middle circle of the wheel are a bunch of different verbs. So each layer of the taxonomy has a list of verbs associated with it. So when I was building this training material, this learning object for office hours, I said, what do I want my people to remember? What do I want audience to remember? I want you to remember that there's a person named Bloom, and that he had 6 different levels of his taxonomy. So I took up my remembering section. I choose a verb. After attending this training or after watching this video, my learners will be able to label the 6 different levels of Bloom's taxonomy. And I might give you an activity in the test, a matching activity, which is that outer layer, are specific activities that you can do to see whether the person is able to change the way you wanted them to change. So this is a tool that I like to use personally. And if you come to our Discord channel, we'll have links to all of these different visual aids. But when I'm writing objectives, I start with what do I want my person to do? I come to the wheel here and I identify which different levels of the taxonomy do I want my learner to utilize. And I personally don't subscribe super strongly to a hierarchical approach. And then lastly, I say, well, which activity will help get the level of learning that I want? So I start in the center of the wheel and I work my way out. And I invite you guys to do the same. So for those of you who, before we took the break, asked yourself, what do I want to change as a result of this? Look at your learning objective again. Do you have a clear and specific verb? Do you know what you want to be different after watching this video? And maybe that's changed. Or maybe that will drive some questions that you can put into our chat. Really what it boils down to is learning objectives help you as the teacher build something that will allow your learners to change. Some people think learners should know the learning objectives, and we can discuss that during our question and answer here in just a moment. Some people think that it's really for the teacher. Some people agree with Bloom's taxonomy and some disagree with it. The question would be, is a taxonomy the proper approach? Is thinking and learning really hierarchical? Is it better to be more creative than to be able to remember? Does it show that the person's learned more? Or is thinking and learning more emergent? And you move from layer to layer at different times. People critique Bloom's by saying that by using Bloom's, you're sacrificing the individuals in your classroom for the sake of becoming more efficient and standardized. Is that a good thing? And again, maybe the audience makes a difference. Maybe when you're talking to general education and teachers, maybe the goal isn't to have a factory that pops out kids who can do reading, writing, and arithmetic. Maybe the goal is bigger formation, and maybe Bloom's does or doesn't help that. In a corporate environment, you always have to show the return on investment. So we typically do use a structured learning approach, a hierarchical approach like Bloom's. Another common critique with Bloom specifically is it's old, and it was created before research-driven approaches to learning were really the norm. It's very intuitive, and it resonates with you, but maybe it hasn't been tested or validated in a unbiased research situation. And lastly, people critique Bloom's and say, well, is Bloom's truly learner-centric? And what I want to talk about that is next week. So this week we're talking about structured learning, especially using learning objectives. But next week, Dave Troutman is going to be hosting us, and he's going to teach us a totally different approach to building learning materials. Instead of starting top down with your objectives and building based off of that, which we're talking about today, Dave's going to be talking about a bottom up approach that really puts the learner in the center. So we invite you to come back next week too. That's it for the main lesson. Now let's take a look at our questions and see, have you in the audience drive our conversation today? What questions do you have about learning objectives? How can we help you become a better teacher or instructor about learning objectives? So, Ken, I think, what's our first question?
Very good, John. The first question comes to us from Douglas Carmichael, and he asks, how can you segment larger learning objectives when working with students that are easily overwhelmed? And he mentions autism spectrum and so forth.
What do you think, Aaron?
So this is right up my alley because those are a bunch of students that I teach this year. So basically with any group of students or adults, really, taking a very large goal and breaking it down into smaller pieces is what we're supposed to be doing. So for an example, in third grade, because that's what I teach, the students have to learn how to be able to round to the nearest 10, 100, and 1,000 within about 10 days of school, within the first couple days of school. So instead of throwing that up on the board or saying, we're going to round to the nearest 10, 100, and 1,000, I pick one for every 3 days. So I'll say, we're going to round to the nearest 10 using a number line. We're going to round to the nearest 10 using just the number, and then one more activity. But I'm still focusing on just rounding to the nearest 10. And then I do a quick assessment, make sure everybody's on the right page. Then I move on. So instead of trying to throw everything at the students, you have to break it down just little pieces by little pieces, because the way I really do think about objectives is when we're in lesson planning in general is driving a car. When we're thinking about where we need to be, maybe somewhere we haven't been before, we put our destination in the GPS. So that's our destination. That's our goal, to end up at this place. And then you have to break it down by steps. Like first, you go down this street and a mile and a half later, you take a right. Well, I'm not going to throw all the directions up on the board for all the kids to know or for me to look at when I'm driving. I'm going to look at the first chunk and then move on from there. So teachers hopefully naturally take that into consideration depending on who's in front of them.
Thank you. Harshit.
Yeah, I like to break things down myself just because overall idea can be overwhelming even for vision impaired people. So, looking at the idea of someone tells you to go to a website and log in and then buy this and click here and click, that could be overwhelming just in the sense of how do you get there? So breaking things into processes for me personally works better. So as Aaron mentioned, the objectives are still rounding to the nearest 10th, but the processes were kind of introduced to you a little bit differently. So you got to inhale or, get that information a little bit differently. So the best approach that I've had is to break it down into either categorical situations. So for like a screen reader, you might just want to know, let's go to your website, favorite website you have. And when you don't know what you don't know, it's going to stick out. And what you do know is going to stick out as well. So for me, making these processes to be a little bit easier becomes where I get to learn about you first, rather than I just bombard you with, you got to hit that button. That's overwhelming. So I think to learn the person that is in front of you is also really important, because they might give you all the tools that you need to make your own objectives and learning lessons.
Great. What do you think, Dr. Clark?
I think that it's been very helpful to me as a teacher, but also to teachers whom I've interviewed and observed, that they have an implicit meta objective each time we interact with our students. And that is to have a morning or an hour or a 15-minute interaction that is characterized by safety, trust, and care for both the adult or the teacher and the students. So that's sort of the big idea that I work toward, I monitor, I hope for. It's not written on the board. It's not going to be subject to a test, but in a sense, it's an objective for the authority, the instructor. And then within that, as we tend that meta objective, then and if that's well established and experienced by all, then it is possible to say with a social skills class that includes students who are on the autism spectrum. Let's see if today we can practice a solid handshake with eye contact, for example. And we all have to decide in the moment whether this is a good day for that, or whether all of us are going to do it, or whether we're going to watch a pair of students up front do that, or shake hands with the teacher or with peers. And all of those decisions are made in what's called interactive decision making by the teacher, who is there, who can sense and sample the social environment, or what looks like it's too challenging today for this or that student, or for all of us. So that's the way I think about the embedding or the breaking down, is that first we have to establish and reestablish and tend and nurture this constructive learning environment where everybody feels safe to be to try and fail, where the barrier or the consequences of not getting it right the first time are low. And then that opens us up to the possibility of stretching ourselves a little bit beyond the comfort zone, not a lot beyond it, but one step beyond what's called the zone of proximal development. That's what I had to say.
Thank you. Alex, what do you think?
You know, finding ways that students can work at their own pace is super important. And, I think that this really underlines the need for really considering some version, it doesn't work everywhere, some version of flipping the classroom where videos are made available that they can scan through, watch at their own speed, rewatch as needed. So one of the problems really that I found with lecturing, and I ran into this, I have to admit, by accident. I was teaching visual effects at San Francisco State University while I was working at ILM. And then I shifted a couple of years later to teaching kids who are 8 to 12. I taught them the same content. Like what I taught in college and what I taught to kids was exactly the same. And the 8 to 12-year-olds actually did better than the college students did as far as absorbing the information. But what had changed was I had accidentally, had to flip the classroom for a variety of reasons. And what I found was that the students who were really advanced watched it at 2x, and the students that were not having trouble could hit rewind and do it again and again and again, raise their hand. And because I'm not lecturing, because I'm able to freely go to each student that's having trouble. More importantly, the students that were advanced were able to help the other students around them. And one of the things that we started after a couple of years started to incorporate is students that were advanced helping other students. If those students that they helped, we gave them these little coins that I got at some arcade or something like, and they give them a coin. Those are extra credit. So what happened was the students that were advanced were engaging with the other students to collect all those coins and help them, but they had to really help them. If they didn't help them, if they just told them things, they wouldn't give them the coin. And there were some arguments there, but anyway, they would go out and collect them. And one thing that I also would say is how important extra credit is, of giving the advanced students a reason to push harder. It's very easy for a very advanced student to just get stuff done and then move on to something else or to whatever, and giving them a stretch and a benefit from that. I think that, that I know my daughter is very turned on by extra credit. So she's got I think her lowest score right now is 98.9, and we're trying to figure out what happened to that last 1.1. But she goes crazy over extra credit, as well as making sure that she doesn't miss anything. And I think that giving advanced students that opportunity, and especially if it has to do with helping other students, can help. But I think that part of that is really about flipping that classroom and getting to a point where you're doing what all I did was just capture what I was going to lecture. Like I didn't do anything crazy. I didn't have time. I literally did a screen capture of what I was going to do and handed it to the students. And then some of the students, again, played it at much faster rates, and some of them played it over and over again, but they all were able to ingest that information as needed.
Awesome. Tony?
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize the fact that in most cases, when you're dealing with students that are on the spectrum, there is an IEP in place. And because there is an IEP in place, it's important to understand that each student is different and each student's team that have come together to plan out the objectives for that student needs to be honored because it's the law. And so it's important for us to recognize that that is an essential part of each individual person's needs being met.
Yeah, and I have two children with autism, and they both are on IEPs. And isn't it interesting that we only individualize the education plan when someone has a special need? To answer your question, Douglas, I think all learners, and we'll talk about the science of learning and cognition over the weeks. It's almost always more effective to break education down into smaller bite-sized chunks, no matter the person's personal needs. Everyone learns better that way. And so really when you're approaching different audiences is how do we use research-based, scientifically backed approaches to education, and how do we customize those to our particular audience? So stay tuned for future weeks. We'll be talking about some of those things. But before we do, what's our next question, Ken?
Well, here's a question about the bits and pieces to you, John, from Tony Mobley. He asks, John, what are you using today? Is it PowerPoint or Keynote? Could you describe the tools and the hardware and the software?
I sure can. The secret sauce to my presentation today is I just have a black Keynote presentation, and I'm playing that through on a secondary screen. And my ATEM Mini is using a Luma key to basically combine my video image with my presentation. And that is definitely going to be one of the topics at a future education hour. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael asks, when crafting learning objectives, how can you build parent involvement into your educational strategy without creating a habit of over-dependency in the parent-student relationship?
I'd like to focus especially on the parent relation or the teacher-parent relationship and how does that impact our learning objectives. What do you think, Dr. Clark?
I have a little story about parent involvement that I think might enrich this conversation. It's a story that happened as a result of the COVID isolation and the pivot to remote instruction, virtual instruction. And in this case, it was my daughter who is a clinical professor of speech language pathology. And the clinics that Arizona State University offers had to be switched from face-to-face clinics with an observation room and so forth to online clinical services or telepractice. And in the face-to-face situation before COVID, parents would come with their children who were being served by the speech language clinic. They would be in the building, they might be observing, they might be chatting with other parents. They weren't very involved with the delivery of the clinical therapy. They were allowed to, but as it evolved, they weren't. However, when things had to be switched to virtual instruction, rather clinical services delivered to the child and parents' home, the parents were very involved. They were necessary parts of the system in making sure that the technology worked and that the requests and suggestions by the clinician were complied with by the child who was the client and so forth. And in my daughter's judgment, this increased the effectiveness of the clinical service because the parent was able to continue to repeat and practice or have their child practice at home the kinds of techniques for minimizing stuttering, for example, because the parent was very involved in the delivery of those clinical services. So I think it's an interesting story about an unsuspected side effect of COVID and the pivot to the temporary pivot anyway to a virtual clinical practice that suggests perhaps a partial answer to Douglas's question that a way to get parents involved that could have carry-on effects beyond the limited classroom or clinic time is to have the parent intimately involved in the delivery of the service.
Thank you, Aaron.
What my district does, and I think this is a really great idea, was to take our curriculum maps. Each grade level has them for reading, for writing, math, for all the subjects, and they put them up on the district's website. So at any time, anyone can go to the website and check out where third grade should be right now. Now, obviously, parents understand that if we need more time on a subject, we're going to spend more time. The other thing that I do in my classroom is that I send out a bi-weekly newsletter saying what we're going to be working on over the next 2 weeks, but very summarized. So, this week we'll be working on rounding, and the week after we're going to start working on addition strategies. So that way parents know that if they want to help their kids or help them, remember for class, that they can kind of prep them for that.
Thank you. And I find, as working with my kids' teachers, it's up to the parents to initiate. So if you are a parent, I strongly encourage you to initiate those relationships with your teachers. They've got 30 different kids, and that's a potential of, up to 100 different relationships, parent relationships, depending on family situations. So you take the first step and help our teachers out. What's our next question, Ken?
Next question comes from John Snyder. Who are learning objectives for, the student or the teacher?
And wanting to be mindful of time, let's try to make our answers as efficient as we can, reasonably. Emily?
Yeah, learning objectives are for both. They're for students and for educators. It guides the learning for the educator. So how am I going to present this information, work backwards from what the outcome I want my students to have at the end? It's really important. But as far as being explicit, like putting it on the board every day and having the students refer to it, I'm not sure that especially at the secondary level, is necessary. But I also think that the students need to know what they're trying to achieve, what the goal of their learning for this particular unit or skill that they're learning, like what is that outcome that they need by the end. So I think it works for both. Again, worry about the formula of it.
Emily, do you think it's helpful to have posted the learning objectives for your learners?
I think it's okay to have it, like in my syllabus or in my, I did online syllabus for my kids, so I could update it and say like, okay, in this unit, we're going to learn how to write a persuasive essay and evaluate, and evaluate, the resources that we're going to use to back up our argument and giving the students that information. But to provide it broken down by blooms, I feel is hierarchical and reductive of what the students are actually learning and can deter them from wanting to do something because they're like, well, I know what the 4 causes of this problem were, but can I really explain and use it to forward my point that I'm trying to express? And if they can't, if they can do that, if they can express it, then they understand it. So we don't need to go, today we're going to work on recall, and then we're going to work on understanding, and then we're going to work on analyzing, and then we're going to get to creating. And I feel like that's very reductive and formulaic. And if you have a really good lesson that ends with the creative or the synthesis at the top, you're going to do all those things as you work through the project or the skill. So I kind of fall on like a, yes, we need a broad one. Do we need the minute, break it down into check boxes for every day, for every lesson, for every time you walk into my classroom? Absolutely not, in my personal opinion.
Thank you. What do you think, Chris?
very briefly, I agree with what Emily's position. And I would add that I think absent reflection on it, teachers tend not to think that the learning objectives are for them. But I think that is actually where they're more useful. If we use learning objectives to analyze our plan, then what we're doing is asking the question, is there opportunity to learn the 5 things that I'm hoping my students will learn in the plan that I've made for tomorrow or tonight? So it's really more useful as an evaluation device for my plan as a teacher than it is as something, as the answer to the question, will this be on the test? Which I've heard a million times from my students. So that's what that question is about, I think. So it's for it should be more for the teachers than for the learners, I believe. Thank you.
I love that. Is this on the test? Harshit?
I'm going to take the test right now and put it to good use. So I remember a couple pieces as you described them on your presentation. Creative is on top, remembering's at the bottom. Analyze, I guess I heard it twice. Emily mentioned it, and Dr. Clark has did as well. So it's both. You're teaching me something, but you remembered something about how to present that material to me. So the student and the learner, or the teacher, the educator, whomever, I think is in the process of doing both. And today's topic isn't learning Bloom. It's about the objectives and what do they mean to us. So you've hit your marks on what we needed to learn from this conversation that we've had here. And I've remembered at least 3 pieces of that description, and even the verbs in the middle. I'm trying to visualize them. Where were the verbs? I see six slices in my head still, but I'm trying to visualize that those middle verbs that were written there. And like I said, creative goes on top, remembering or retention, I suppose, is at the bottom, and then analyze and such, that is in the middle somewhere.
Thank you. And from the chat, A. Mitchell says, aren't objectives by definition for everyone involved in the process? And I would say, yes, so long as everyone agrees that they're going for the same general goal. I also see in the chat, FPG says, FPG 22, excuse me, specifically for the arts and language skills, people think that having clear articulatable learning objectives is because they're viewed as subjective disciplines, and in fact, some of those disciplines are not. So I think it is a good question as far as who are they for and what do you need with them? Me as a teacher, typically I lean towards that they're more for the teacher as they're designing it, with the teacher keeping their audience in mind, because the teacher's goal is not to teach, the teacher's goal is for their learners to learn. Next question, please.
Comes from Mark Giuliani in the District of Columbia, who asks, how can an owner of a small business use Bloom's taxonomy for training and continuing education of employees?
I'll take this one. So as a corporate trainer, where I find learning objectives to be most helpful is really in those specific hard skills trainings. And what I do typically is I say, how will I know that the investment of my employees' time was valuable? I want something to change in their behavior as a result of attending training. So if it's customer service training, I would use the objective to say they'll use these key phrases more frequently. Or maybe if it's scheduling an appointment, I would verify that they schedule all of their appointments accurately. So I'd use the objectives to say, as a result of this training, my learners will be able to schedule this new appointment type with a 90% accuracy in our test scenario environment. And then I would follow up by listening to their calls and evaluating their calls to make sure that behavior is actually happening on the floor. And you could do the same thing in any endeavor, like customer service. As their boss, you walk around and measure how many times people are smiling if you ask your people to smile as a result of a training. And your objective is, as a result of this training, my employees will smile at all the customers when they walk in the door. Or my employees will use the 5 and 10 rule to make eye contact and smile when they're 10 feet away and ask, how can I help you if they're 5 feet away? And you sit back and observe them to make sure that that learning has been retained and actually acted on. Next question.
Next question comes from Paul Vahus in Austin, Texas. He asks, John, what is your theory of homework?
And this will be our last question, so feel free to raise your hands. And for anyone, what is your personal theory of homework? Aaron, what do you think?
It should not be paper and pencil. It should not be paper and pencil. It should not be a busy work thing for students to do at home. For me, like Alex said, it's all about flipping the classroom. I send home on Google Classroom. I tend to post 2 or 3 videos that are 3 minutes or less each about what we're going to do the next day in class. The students watch the videos, and then I put together a 12-question Bluekit game as a review game. They love playing the games. They play it multiple times, so that way they understand what they're coming into the next day, but they're seeing it as a game and not traditional homework. And that way it's going to be done more frequently.
Thank you. Alex?
I completely agree with Aaron. I don't believe that homework should be tested. Should be graded ever. Like, I don't think if you understand the concepts, you can have, here are extra things that you can learn if you're falling behind. Here are things that you can study. Here are things, but otherwise it's a huge waste of my kid's time. I'm a parent, like, watching this, and we have to deal with it, and it creates a fissure between the student and the class, because when they get behind on their homework, which is generally busy work from what I've looked at over their shoulder, they are now frustrated with the class. They are disengaged with the class, and the class becomes all about the fact that they get all this stupid homework connected to it, And so the thing is the teachers. What I found is the teachers who give my kids, and this is not as a teacher, but as a parent with a child that's 8th and 9th grade, my kids are getting lower grades with lower grades and less retention when they're given homework, because they're more frustrated. They're less engaged, by the whole process. And as soon as they start, my daughter doesn't fall behind, but she gets up early in the morning to finish everything. My son does. I did, And I think that we need to really protect students' time, so that they can individualize after they get out of school. If they want to do art, if they want to do other things, we shouldn't fill it up with a bunch of busy work, which is what homework is. It's a bunch of busy work. And having it exactly as Aaron talked about it, of not graded, but additional learning materials if you're falling behind, or to prepare for the next classroom that are not long, I think makes a ton of sense. Having it be something that they're going to be graded on is poison.
Thank you. And I agree. I think homework in my kids increases a lot of anxiety in them, because they view it as a task to complete or a chore to do, rather than something that helps retain the knowledge. And everything we should be doing when in a training or an educating context should add value and should help reinforce the information we want. And so I do have assignments associated with many of my trainings or follow-up work. And if you join us in our Discord channel, you will see that we'll have some of these questions and some new questions as follow-ups. And the reason why is because spaced repetition is one of those scientifically validated ways to increase learner retention. Is that taking it now and reapplying it, or reactivating those same neural pathways is what makes that learning stick. So homework or assignments can be effective, and many times they are just a chore. So I just want to say thank you, everybody, for joining us again for our Education Hour. We're excited to see you. Next week, we have Dave Troutman talking about the project approach to learning. And if you'll stay with us in after hours today, we have a cooking question and answer session with Damayanti and Hasmukh. Thank you, everyone, again on the back end, and for our panelists for joining us to talk education. We're excited to have you back, and we appreciate all of your feedback, those who are in the chat and asking questions. We can roll our credits. Have a wonderful week.
Good show, everybody.